All right, welcome everyone. Here we are with Dr. Andrew Furco and using research to make the case for service learning. Um, Take it away, Dr. Furco.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. Some familiar faces there. How are you doing? Thank you so much for joining this session. Really appreciate it. So as Anthony mentioned, I'm Andy Furco. I'm from the University of Minnesota here in the United States. I'm professor of education and director of the International Center for Research on Community Engagement at our university. Up until recently, I was associate vice president for public engagement at the university, where Service Learning Center was one of my units that reported to me. And I'm also on the NYLC board. So service learning has been very near and dear to my heart for many years now. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is what we're seeing globally around the advancement of service learning. But I'm also still frustrated by the fact that we still have to try to make the case for service learning as something that is beneficial to our students and our communities. And so what I wanted to talk about today was how can we use research, how can we use research to make the case for service learning? And what I wanted to do in the time we have together is spend a little bit of time of giving a sense of a couple of ways we can think about service learning as a means to advance the work that we do in our educational systems and how we fulfill our public purposes in K-12 and higher education. And then to think about what are some of the things we know from research that we could use to make this case for service learning. I know that there are a lot of great stories to tell around what the students' experiences and what students get out of it, a lot of anecdotal data that we have and evidence that we have from those stories. But oftentimes people ask for the evidence. I know that that's been true at my university when I've been trying to solicit funding for our service learning programs. Where's the evidence? How does it impact our students? How does it impact their learning, et cetera? So hopefully this will give us a little bit of fuel for making that case at our institutions. So just a little bit, again, thank you so much for joining. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions along the way, so I hope you'll all chime in within the chat. So we know that service learning is growing globally. There are many, these are just some of the international and national networks and associations that we're seeing across the globe. It's definitely a global phenomenon that's happening. We have everything from CLICE up there on the upper right, which is the Latin American Service Learning Network, which is throughout Latin America. At the bottom, we have the European Association for Service Learning in Higher Education. On the left there, the bottom is the Service Learning Asia Network, which is throughout Asia. And then there's one there with the beautiful tree there in the middle, Central and Eastern European Service Learning Network, and of course, NYLC and many others. So we are seeing this as a global phenomenon at all sectors of higher education, from primary, secondary schools through tertiary education. So we're definitely seeing a growth. That growth is also evidenced by the volumes that are out there now. When I started out in this field 30 plus years ago, and I see David there, colleague, and David Malone from Duke and others who have been around in this field and experts in this field. You know, when we started out, there was like next to nothing, no literature on this. And now we're just seeing this wonderful plethora of volumes, really wonderful things resources for us to use and rely on. And so that's another evidence of growth. And we're also seeing that that literature in many other languages, not just English language, where a lot of this work has been focused and dominated in the kind of Western Northern parts of the globe. And now we're seeing Global South and in Eastern parts of the globe growth in this area, which is very exciting. And I would say that as a result, we are seeing very different kinds of service learning emerging with different purposes and different intentions behind it. And that's exciting too. And it's giving us a lot to think about in terms of what exactly is service learning and what does it mean in our different areas and different scopes of work. So as part of that, despite all of this growth that we're seeing, we are seeing a continued skepticism in what this work is about. And we are seeing the skepticism has been around for a long time, since service learning began. Throughout the 2000s, this is something Stanley Fish has always been an ongoing critic of our work in this area. Talking about the role of educators, the role of teachers, that, our job is to teach content. It's to teach the subject matters. And it's not about producing active citizens. It's not about inculcating the virtue of tolerance or to redress injustices or bring about political change. That's not our job as educators, as some would argue. Not all of us agree with that, but skeptics of the kinds of work that service learning may promote is definitely out there. We also see it in other kinds of skepticism around the fact that service learning is a nice thing and there are great stories, but there isn't a lot of the theory and the practice around it. And there aren't enough real strong case studies that have been studied systematically that really distinguish between service learning and community service. People say, well, service learning is just glorified volunteerism. It's just another word for volunteerism. And we know, for those of us who do this work, that that's actually not the case. There are substantial distinctions, but there is a sense that there isn't really a clear set of theory, a clear set of practice. At least those who are outside the field, who aren't immersed in the literature and in the field as much as we are, those of us who do this work. So there is this continuing skepticism, often among faculty, but also among, I would say, educational leaders as well, especially when it comes to funding and limited resources. Is where do we put those resources? And sometimes in putting it in programs like service learning is seen as not a priority. And then also the other area is around the fact that there's still skepticism that we don't have enough evidence, that there isn't enough research, that there hasn't been enough systematic study, that we have, we have program evaluations, we have these great stories, but not the kind of evidence that we need. And so that's a continued skepticism that we see, and one that I think we contend with. And with the way our budgets are going these days in education, I think we have to really face the skepticism. And I think that there's lots of ways to do it. And so I'd like to offer a few ways of really thinking about this. I think one of the mistakes we make in thinking about service learning is that those of us who champion this work are really gung-ho about it, and we don't often take a step back to really give it a critical analysis of what the limitations are and what it can do in terms of our communities. Sometimes we give these lofty aims, lofty goals. We're going to reduce poverty, we're going to reduce homelessness, we're going to, change the environment, and these very, very lofty goals that we're going to do in 15-week semester or 20 hours of service. So part of it is really giving a realistic assessment around what we're able to accomplish. And I think also it's also about talking about service learning as quality teaching and as what it means as an effective pedagogy. And so what do we know about what effective pedagogy is? For those of us who are in education who study this work, we do know that when these 7 elements are in place, students learn better. Students are able to immerse themselves in the learning process very differently, more intentionally, and get more out of the learning experience. And this is something that OECD, Office of Education Community Development, Cooperative Development, has studied. They studied a whole series of pedagogies and found that the ones that were most effective were those that had these elements to them. And so authenticity, doing real work for real people with real consequences, we immerse ourselves very differently than when we're doing an assignment for the professor or the teacher. When we have a customer or an audience or a real person or a real group that is going to depend on the work that we produce, we immerse ourselves in that work very differently. Of course, when we're actively engaged, when it's constructivist, when we ask students to construct knowledge rather than delivering the knowledge like I'm doing right now, when it's collaborative, when we're working with others, where we can think and reflect on that work with others and be challenged in our thinking, when it's personalized, when we care about the issue, we're interested in it, when it has personal meaning, we're more invested, when we feel efficacious, empowered, when we feel, the notion of learned helplessness is very real. When we don't feel we can do something, we tend to shy away from it. But when we're empowered in our experiences, we immerse ourselves. And when we get outside of our comfort zone a little bit, we tend to immerse ourselves and engage in that learning process in a very different way than when it's passive and when it's more comfortable. So when all these things are in place, we tend to have effective pedagogy. A lot of us know this, but this is, I think, important for us to be able to make a case for this work. So when OECD studied a number of different pedagogies, they looked at things like project-based learning, problem-based learning, work-based learning, game-based learning, and also service learning, and a couple of others. And so what did they find? They found that these 7 elements that I just mentioned, best practices for pedagogy, were evident in all of these elements. Some of them were evident in all of these: authentic and active and expanding boundaries, etc. But the one that had all 7 of them was service learning, where service learning really, in most cases, had all 7, were found to have all 7 of those pedagogies. So in essence, what we're saying here is that service learning is really high quality pedagogy. And that if we want to do quality teaching in our classrooms, if we want our students to have a quality educational experience pedagogically, that one of the ways to do that is to do service learning. And that's a way that I've been able to make the case at my institution to say, are we interested in quality teaching? If so, well, here's a pedagogy that can help us do that quality teaching. So that's one way to make the case. Another way I think it's important is that service learning also extends student learning beyond classroom learning. And it really expands the learning prospects for students. That if we think about what service learning is able to do, service learning is not just classroom-based learning, right? Students are learning course content when it's integrated with the curriculum. And so they are learning that course content. So that's a given in academic service learning experiences. But students are also learning community-based experiences where they're learning about service and learning how to do service. So in many service learning experiences, students are learning new skills, new techniques, learning about communities, learning about how to actually perform that service, how to enter a community, how to stand up in front of a group of people and give a presentation, how to do some technical work that might be needed in the community. This may not necessarily be part of the course content. And so these are new skills, new learnings that the student is experiencing. And then, of course, students, to make it service learning, students are also learning about a societal issue, a social issue. What really makes high quality service learning is when students are thinking about the societal issue that undergirds the service. So it's not just doing the service, but why are people homeless? Who is homeless, right? Or why is there poverty? Or what is causing climate change? So they're really thinking about societal issue. That's kind of the reflection piece as well. That's very important. So basically, what service learning does is really extend the learning experience of students beyond the classroom piece and gets to that holistic learning, the personal, the social, the whole child, that kind of learning process, which we talk a lot about in education. And so that's another case, I think, to make, where we think about these experiences, where we reflect on societal issue and the learning content. That's about academic achievement piece, the academic aspect. And then we talk about the social responsibility pieces, about becoming active citizenship and social responsibility. And this is together makes that kind of service learning experience. And so I think it's important for us to really use this as a way of making that case. And I've used it in my university to say, you know, part of in our mission statement, we say we're going to prepare students for productive citizenship and active social responsibility. And how do we do that within the academic realm of what we teach in our classrooms? And this becomes a way of fulfilling that mission. So again, it's that extension. Sometimes we don't see that when we talk about our service learning experiences. So, and then the other way, I think, is really to use the research to talk about what we know about the research. So here are just some of the articles. People say there's no research in service learning. There's not enough research in service learning. There's no evidence. Well, actually, there are about 1,200 published studies, at least, English language published studies that talk about the effects of service learning and how it impacts various aspects of those who participate. So I wanted to ask you, if you want to, in the chat, what do you think is the biggest, most looked at constituents in service learning research? In other words, when we look at what is sort of the big constituency area where most research has been conducted, where do you think the research is focused on? Let me see if I can access the chat here. Here we go. Okay, students. Higher ed. Okay. Much benefit on higher ed, little K-12. Teachers, okay. I'm assuming you can all see the chat. Reflection, use media. Okay. Okay, sorry, I've got to move my chat here. All right, great. Youth benefits. Okay, so yes, that's actually quite accurate in that we do see a lot of research in that area. So of these studies we have about 1,200 published research studies, actually more than that now. Increasingly, we continue to get more and more, but in English language research, it's about 1,200. About 90% of them are in service learning in higher education, and not a lot in K-12 work. And there are lots of reasons for that. One is doing work with K-12 students requires parental consent, and it's a little more difficult. The measures and instruments that we have are a little bit more challenging to develop for younger students, younger individuals, younger populations. And so that becomes more challenging to do. And there are no, and actually most of the research that we see in the field are done by faculty in higher education around service learning in their discipline. So biology professors doing service learning for their own courses or in their own field, or you saw dental studies, etc. So it's faculty in higher education who do service learning in the context of their particular area of study. In K-12, it becomes a little more difficult because many faculty don't do research in K-12. So that's where I think the disparity is, in addition to making it's just more difficult to study younger individuals. So we do see that. And I think the dearth of K-12 service learning research, I think is problematic for advancing service learning K-12 education. We certainly saw that after the end of Learn and Serve America in 2011, where that funding for K-12 really made a difference. And when that funding ended, a lot of the K-12 programs ended. Whereas in higher education, we were able, I think, to continue that, a lot of it because of that research that was available. Where is the research? So most of the research, well, I'm sorry, where is the research? Most of the research is across these 4 areas. So there's impact studies, and those impact studies really are about 85%. I'm sorry, about 85% of the of where the research is. There's implementation studies. So impact is, you know, the outcomes of service learning on particular participants and constituents. Implementation studies have to do with the quality and what goes into the service learning experience. So questions about reflection, how much reflection, and when should we do a reflection, or how much linkages should there be, or how many hours of service, and that sort of thing, the inputs into service learning, and what are the implications of that. Another area of study is on institutionalizing, sustaining this work in our educational systems. And another set of research is on international work, meaning both doing service learning in non-domestic settings, and also what is happening outside of the US in research in other areas around the globe. And we're seeing more and more research being published outside of the US. So with that, I want to ask you this question now. What is the most asked research question about service learning? What do you think is the most researched question about service learning? And I can't find my chat. There you are. Whoops, sorry. Sorry, everyone. I'm struggling here with this chat. I can't find the chat. Anthony, can you read the chat for me?
Yes, I can do that for you.
I closed it because it was blocking my screen, so.
That's okay. We have academic impact on students.
Great.
Yeah. Does it product quantified impact on students?
Okay.
How does it impact test scores? Academic outcomes, measure the impact of service learning. Impact.
Anything else?
Nope, that's all.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, so it's interesting that we continue, despite the fact that we do have all this research, we do continue to see a lot of questions around the academic outcomes of service learning. And that is understandable, given that this is about engaging students in community service and service learning experiences. And therefore, the educational value of service learning is a primary concern for schools and universities, college universities. And so that continues to be the case, even though we do have quite a bit of evidence of service learning and academic achievement. And this is where the areas of research are in terms of the different participants. And I'll go through some of the ones around students, because that's where we do see the large majority of the research, as I mentioned. But we also see some research on teachers in terms of their motivation for doing this work, changing attitudes towards teaching. And there's quite a bit of evidence around changing how we approach our teaching process and our attitudes towards the teaching profession. And then our own efficacy with service learning and how that's evolved by engaging with communities and doing this kind of work. And then with institutions as well. The climate of the institution, school climate. There are a couple of wonderful studies around school climate and the intersection with character and values development as well. Community perceptions, student retention rates, broader institutional questions. Where we don't have a lot of research is around community and community impact. Very, very little. And the question is, are we really doing service learning? Are we really impacting our communities? Are we making a difference for our communities? And we really do not have much evidence in that realm. And this is where I think we run into some challenges with service learning, not so much internally, but externally with our community partners. I can tell you my university, you know, George Floyd was killed about 3 miles from my campus. And despite the fact that we have a great deal of community engagement and service learning activities happening, community questioned whether we're really making a difference and whether our university is contributing in any significant way. And I think making and looking at community impacts is really quite challenging, because it's very hard to attribute any real big community change like what we say we do in service learning, like I mentioned earlier, reducing homelessness, reducing poverty, you know, the claims we make, to, you know, 20-hour service learning experiences, which is the average service learning experience. So if we could reduce homelessness in 20 hours, we'd all be doing service learning many times over. So I think part of it is how we calibrate the claims we make around the impacts and how we then measure those impacts in the community. And the impacts we measure have to be measurable and commensurate with what actually might be achieved. And I think sometimes there is a big disconnect around that. Plus the fact that within communities, there are so many confounding factors that go into any real change in community, that to separate out the service learning experience that we do and to attribute that change specifically to our service learning experience can be difficult to do without a lot of controls on those counter arguments for why we see those changes. So this is just difficult research to do. Attempts have been made. We do see some things on particular groups of individuals who've been part of the service in the community, who've been part of the service learning experience, but it is very, very challenging research to do. And I think this is a place where we need to think strategically about what we might do, and that might mean doing some work, multiple site work that might look at similar types of service learning experiences with similar community settings, that then we might find a preponderance of evidence across different studies, where all the studies may find the same thing or have similar outcomes. And then we could say across these sites doing similar service learning in similar types of communities, we are seeing some promising findings. So what do we know about academic outcomes? Well, we do know there are studies that have told us very much about content and skills, knowledge and skills. One of the best studies, I think, was an early study in 1993 by Marcus Howard and King, where they did random assignment of students to different sections of the same political science course. Some that had service learning, 2 that had service learning, 4 that did not. The 2 that had service learning, the students did better on the content knowledge of that course. So what the students were expected to learn in that course, academic-wise, content-wise. And there are a number of studies that have replicated that, a few, and then a number of studies that demonstrate that. And we also see that in some K-12 studies as well. So students can gain better content knowledge and skills, high order thinking skills and analysis, evaluation, etc. Definitely that high order thinking skill process, critical thinking skills have been studied and shown in that OED analysis I shared with you earlier, really looked at this issue as well and found service learning had the literature on the research on service learning was very promising in that area. Re-enrollment and persistence, we see this in the higher ed literature, that students that do service learning do re-enroll and persist in the institution. I just finished a 5-year U.S. Department of Education study looking at underrepresented students, Pell eligible, first generation, and students of color, and BIPOC students. And we found that students who participated in a service learning experience were more likely to persist and re-enroll and graduate when compared to students with similar characteristics. We use propensity score matching and a whole other set of techniques. So there is emerging research in that area, and then other research around attendance, grade point average, students show up when they're service learning, those kinds of things. So we do have a number of studies that show academic outcomes. I'm happy to share the bibliographies with you if you like. Other areas where we see student development, I'm focusing on student development because student issues, because this is where most of the research is in areas of civic development, agency, commitment to service, those kinds of things, career awareness. Students who participate get very clear work-based learning skills that they might use, teamwork, other kinds of technical skills when they do service activities. Also, this career awareness of, oh, I want to be a nurse, and then they do a service experience at a health care facility and say, you know what, now I see what nurses really do, and I don't know, that's the right thing for me. So that career awareness happens. A number of studies around that. And then quite a number of studies around personal development, around that sense of self-esteem, empowerment, self-efficacy, and then social development as well. With peers, with relationships between faculty and teachers, between students and communities that are different from their own, that kind of development. So we do see these various areas. So where would you say we see the most impactful areas? Where is the most promising research in these areas? So academic, civic development, career, personal, or social. Where would you say is the most impactful of those areas from service learning? And Anthony, if you could read those for me again. Sorry, I can't see the chat.
That's okay. We have personal, civic development, personal and social, personal and social again.
Okay. Well, this is a very astute group, obviously. and yes, it is personal and social. So, a lot of what we tried to do in making the case for service learning is we want to make that academic case, to say, service learning really promotes academic outcomes. And in fact, in recently, in some of the meta-analysis that we've done, not I've done, those in the field have done, they do show some more promising academic outcomes than we've seen previously. So that's really good to know. And we are seeing that academic aspect. But again, I would say a lot of those outcomes are mixed in the research. So we have studies that have shown no academic outcomes, positive outcomes for doing service learning compared to regular, business as usual, or if we had other pedagogies, there wasn't really a difference academically in the students' outcomes. So the question is it worth all the time and effort to do service learning if there aren't going to be those academic outcomes? Civic career, the same thing. We do see some mixed, generally positive findings as well, but mixed, with not very large effect sizes. So we may see some significant findings, but the overall effect isn't all that great. So, I mean, not very large, I should say. And so therefore, again, people weigh the option. Is it worth the investment, the time, the effort, the building of the partnerships, all the things that we have to do? But where we do see the most consistent, the most robust findings in terms of effect sizes, where we do see them consistent in terms of the different kinds of service learning, different types of students, different grade levels, different types of service learning experiences, is around the personal and social development areas. Very consistent findings, very positive findings across a series of areas. And so that's where I would put my money in terms of the impacts of service learning. So the question then is, well, is that a good enough evidence when it comes to budgets, academic budgets, when it comes to making the case for service learning in our classrooms to convince teachers or professors that they should perhaps engage students in service learning, or our principals or our presidents or provosts, that we should invest funds and time in this. And so we do want to really try to make this case here of service learning and academic achievement. And we do know that, like I said, there are studies that do show this, especially when there are high dimensions of dimensions of high quality practice, right? Not all service learning is equal. There are service learning experiences that are terrible, that reinforce stereotypes, that do more harm than good, that are not well planned, that students go off and they do things what they're not prepared to do. I remember in one of my early experiences when I was out west at UC Berkeley, and students wanted to go do some work at the AIDS hospice, and they were just not prepared for that. They went there and they were devastated by that experience because they were just not prepared. So part of it is, is there preparation? Is there all the kinds of things? And thanks to the work that NYLC and others have done, we do have some quality standards for service learning. And these are important to keep in mind, because we do know when the quality of service learning is higher, the outcomes are going to be better for our students. Meaningful service, obviously, if the service is meaningful, it's going to make a difference. There's that personal connections that's there. The integration with the curriculum, that hyphen, the stronger the hyphen, the bolder the hyphen, I should say, the more likely it's going to be high quality. If there's reflection, I like to look at it as analysis of the issues, not just this is what we did, but this is what we've learned. This is what we learned about the issues. This is, a deep kind of thinking and analysis. Diversity being really important, understanding different aspects, different points of view, that really makes a difference. Of course, student voice, the kinds of reciprocal partnerships, mutually beneficial. Are we monitoring what's happening, shifting course, changing course when things aren't happening the way we want them to happen, and of sufficient duration and intensity? And there's some studies that have shown 20 hours is minimum, 40 hours you start to get diminishing returns. That's one study there, but there are some looking at that, but there has to be some sufficient duration. So these are the quality standards, and probably know them very well. So when service learning is high quality, we tend to have a higher academic achievement and higher outcomes. And then we did say that when service learning does produce these kinds of personal and social outcomes, and there's a lot of research that has demonstrated this. And this is where I would put a lot of weight on making the case. In terms of verifiable evidence around self-esteem, this notion of empowerment, motivation, students become more motivated for the learning experience, more engaged in the learning experiences, sense of belonging. And we do know from lots of research that has nothing to do with service learning that students who have higher self-esteem do better academically. These, in fact, are mediating factors for academic achievement. So students who have higher self-esteem do better academically. Students who are more motivated, the higher motivation level is tied to academic achievement. Engagement is higher in learning is tied to academic achievement. So these are so even though service learning promotes personal social development, we can strongly make the case around that more than academic achievement, perhaps. The way to make the case, I would say, is to say that, well, service learning helps promote these mediating factors that promote academic achievement. So for students who have high self-esteem, who are already very empowered, highly motivated, very engaged already in the learning process, they're probably going to do well academically anyway, or more likely to. And so service learning may not have as much of an effect on them in terms of academic achievement. It may help them in some other ways, career, civic. But for students, perhaps, who don't have high self-esteem, who aren't very motivated, aren't very engaged, don't feel a sense of belonging, they may be at risk of not doing well academically, but service learning can help boost these aspects that can help them put them in a position, create the conditions for them to do better academically. So I think, for students who are at risk of not doing well academically, I think service learning can be very powerful in that regard. And I think that that's an important point, because this is a population of students that we sometimes trying to find ways to engage them in ways that help them achieve academically. And so service learning can be one of those ways to really help those students gain in that process. So what are some of the current trends right now we're seeing in research around students? We're starting to see a growing focus on the impact of service learning on particular groups, like students with physical challenges, or students in special education, students in particular racial groups, students in particular age groups. And so we're starting to see some qualification of service learning in particular contexts, which I think helps bring out some of those nuances that we don't generally see when we just cast everything as everyone as a student. So that's important. Some developmental longitudinal questions. This has to do with, what does it look like when students are progressing through the service learning continuum through their educational experiences. So if they have an experience in elementary school, and then one in middle school, then one in high school, then in college, university, etc., what does that look like? And is there a cumulative impact that's happening? So some longitudinal studies are happening in that regard developmentally. And then also longitudinally, what happens, how long do these outcomes last? Do they last just through the summer after the academic year is over, or do we have longer term outcomes? And so those questions are being looked at. And here's some of the outcomes areas. I won't go through them, but these are some of the things that are being looked for in terms of some outcomes that people are interested in for students. A couple of other areas, we're also seeing an increase in research on faculty, on teachers, why they do service learning, what's their what they hope to accomplish, what are the purposes behind them. And I think this is important because service learning is done for different purposes, and the purposes that are set out by the faculty member are going to obviously impact the students. So if there's a more civic focused to help students develop civic understanding, that's going to impact the kinds of outcomes that students may get out of that experience than if it's more academic or personal or some of these other areas. And then obviously connections to service learning and faculty advancement as promotion and tenure, especially at the university level, and even in K-12 in terms of being able to be successful as an educator. And then how faculty feel about the community, their students, faculty attitudes, and changes in faculty attitudes overall. And then some areas around implementation. What are the combination of the elements of service learning that promote positive student outcomes? So we saw all those high quality practices. Is there a combination, a best combination in terms of preparation and reflection and monitoring and meaningful service and all the kinds of things that go into it? Is there a formula that produces better outcomes or more positive outcomes for students? The issue of should it be required continues, and these different frames of service learning that have emerged. We now have a lot of international service learning where students are going to other countries, critical service learning where systemic inequities are being challenged, where that becomes an important part of what the service learning experience is about, where power and privilege are being looked at. This notion of the savior syndrome, where we go in and we're saving communities, and how do we calibrate the power differentials in that? So that's emerging and become a very important part of the work. Social learning entrepreneurship, where students are developing micro enterprises and developing entrepreneurship experiences, working with business and industry on looking at solutions to societal issues. So building technology, building different kinds of utilizing the resources that businesses and industries have, and building that social corporate responsibility that a lot of businesses are moving into. And so students are getting more involved with that, social justice kinds of work and other kinds of work. So we are starting to see research on these different frames, and these different frames have different intentions and purposes behind them. And do they make a difference in how we apply these frames to service learning? Because again, we see the service learning literature as sort of this monolith, but in essence, there are these very important nuances. So in the interest of time here, I've just got a couple more minutes, and I'd like to open up to your questions. I do want to say that just to quickly share sort of a study that we did several years ago, which really kind of raised an issue about this notion of the nuances in service learning. So this is on Rick Battistoni's work, really thinking about these different frames of service learning, this notion of doing charity work, you know, and on the right-hand side, it's just an example. I go back to the homelessness example, what it might look like, these different types might look like, you know, so charities, you know, we serve the food to homeless, which is a great thing to do, as opposed to empowering, doing more empowering of those of those of us in the community who might benefit from service learning. It's really about building empowerment among community members, or public work where there's actually a mobilization of doing something that will help advance that work in a more sustained way. And then the democracy one is about more civic oriented. So we might secure legislation to help persons with who are homeless, who are unhoused. Social action is maybe going to protest. Social change may be to train homeless persons for jobs, or social justice may be to secure some legal assistance and build some justice within some injustices, for some injustices. So these are different frames. And one of the things we were curious about is, does it matter? Do these frames matter? And so what we did was we said, students go into this, do students have different preferences? So when a student goes in, do they look for more social action, social change work, or do they have a more charity mindset? And what is the importance of these preferences in terms of whether the experience is matched or mismatched with that? So if I'm a student who really cares about social change and I'm in a more charity-oriented experience, does that make a difference? So what we looked at was the charity approach, which was around direct service to individuals for a short period of time, kind of this helper approach. We're going to go and help communities and that kind of charity approach. And then social change was more on more the empowerment model and the change model. So it's more about shifting the focus on the provider having control over the situation by giving more control to the recipient of the service. And so we used a battery of instruments. I won't go through all these for the study. And we had these dependent outcomes, these post outcomes at the end. To what extent do the students learn about the community? We had about 1,600 students participate in the study, their satisfaction with college, this is higher ed, obviously, and interpersonal effectiveness. And so I'm going to try to explain this just very quickly here. On the left-hand side, I'm sorry, the top side, across the top, you have the students' preferences. Did students prefer charity? Did they prefer social change? High value undifferentiated is, did they prefer both charity and social change, which is possible, or did they not, in the metric, in the instrument we use, did they indicate that they really didn't prefer either? Then on the left-hand column, you have the service sites. So the high charity, low social change means the service activities at the site were high charity oriented and low on social change. The next row down, That means low charity means they were high in social change, but low in charity. The next row down means they were high in both. The next one down is low in both. Okay, so then you see 69 there on the top left-hand corner in blue. So that meant that 69 students out of the 1,247 that we had data for around this aspect here had preferred charity, and they were in a situation, a service activity that was very high charity. That was a match for them. They preferred high charity, and they were in a situation that was charity, high focused on charity. That's a match. If we move over to the second column, we had 46 students that preferred social change, had a high preference for social change, but they were in a high charity experience. So that was a mismatch. That's in red. The next column, high value undifferentiated, 75. These were students who preferred both, but were in a high charity. We consider that a match. If you go down to the second column, they were in high social change. That's also a match. Down the next row, I should say, 195. High charity, high social change. They prefer both. That's a match. And then low charity, low social change. Obviously, that's not a match. Okay, so you kind of get the blue is the match, red is mismatch. Okay, so what did we find? Well, we found that match matters. When it came to learning about the community, we found, this is a 0.05 significance, we found that these means were different, statistically significantly different when there was a match. So those that preferred charity and had a high charity means were higher than on learning about the community scale that we had versus those that had no match, etc. We found that for the learning about community scale. We found that for the satisfaction with college scale. And we found that with the interpersonal effectiveness scale. So what does this mean? This is just one study, but we thought that that was quite interesting in understanding that we need to get a better sense of what our students are looking for and what they perceive the service experience to be, and really then thinking about how we might match that, or how we might get students to think differently about the particular experiences that in which they might encounter. Maybe we do want students to think about social change, and they have a charity mindset. So how do we get students to address that? And how do we get the students to reflect in ways that can help them understand what the particular service experience is versus what their preference might be? So anyway, I just wanted to kind of throw that out. These are the kinds of research that are being done to really unpack all the different nuances in service learning. The last thing I want to just say is, when we do these kind of trainings around making the case, we kind of say, okay, if you're working on making a case and you're struggling with getting support for service learning, we kind of do this exercise. You have been selected to be the upcoming spokesperson for the upcoming policy council meeting at your institution to make the case. How might you use research to make the case? And we're walking through sort of some of the things that we talked about today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, because what I'd like to do is open it up for your questions. I so appreciate your attention. Thank you so very much. And with that, anyone have any questions, comments you'd like to ask?
So I had a question, and thank you so
Yes.
much. Hi, my name is Leah Story.
Hi, Leah.
And from Miami. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about measuring civic development, when you're talking about the studies that followed that and what those measures looked like.
Yeah, thank you, Leah, very much. That's one area that has been really talked about quite a bit, because part of initially Learn and Serve was about civic responsibility, and that was a big thrust of the Learn and Serve area. And so a number of forums were held where researchers came together, and practitioners as well, to really think about what does civic responsibility mean. And we talked about the fact, is it an attitude? Is it a skill? Is it a disposition? Is it a action? And there was some sense of framing around the fact that civic responsibility means so many different things. And so part of the measures that are out there, there is a civic responsibility scale, for example. A lot of them are very much, I would call self-report kinds of scales. I feel like I'm civically responsible. Civic responsibility often has a frame around service, around voting, around political aspects, around involvement in civic affairs. It's less about issues around empathy for communities, a sense of social justice kinds of things. And those tend to be cast more in a social development kind of framing. So the civic responsibility aspects have tended to lean very much around, I would say, the political, the voting, the legislative kinds of framings. And then a lot of them have been sort of, do I participate? There hasn't been, I think the best work around civic responsibility has over at Circle, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Education. I think I got that right. Over at Tufts, Peter Levine's work. I think they've really unpacked the notion of civic responsibility in all its dimensions. And I would take a look at that work. But the scales are very, I think, self-reported scales. I don't see anything that's very empirical that's come in.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bibliographies. Yes, I'm happy to share bibliographies with you. They are, I didn't want to put them in the slides there. That's a lot of research. So there are a number of bibliographies that are out there, by the way. And I'm happy to share bibliography with you. So yes, I can send it. Let's see who's on. Pam, can I send you the bibliography to share?
Sure, no problem.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we have David and we have John. David. Hi, David. Nice to see you.
It's good to see you. One of your slides early on, when it was speaking about skepticism, said, I think it was the slide from the school superintendent AASA, that there wasn't hard evidence that most of the work was program evaluation, not research. Could you just say a few sentences about how you might distinguish between program evaluation and what is thought of as research?
Yeah, it's great question. This is like a course on research. Okay, there's a whole sort of literature on this distinction that a lot of us have debated over the years. So a program evaluation would be really much around, does a program achieve its intended goals? So basically, the evaluation is done based on the intended goals that are sought to be achieved. And it's very bound by the specific activities within that goal, those goals. A research project would be more around thinking about a particular theory or a particular hypothesis that one might have about potential outcomes that may or may not be the intention of the experience. And to say, for example, take these service learning experiences, do they promote students' self-esteem? Because there's this suggestion that service learning does that. even though the experience may not be around promoting students' self-esteem, a systematic analysis is done to determine whether that is the case. Now, you could still do that with a program, but with the research, you're really going beyond what perhaps some of the goals might be for the program. A program evaluation can also be a research study, in that the research may also include some of these other aspects. So that's where we kind of have parameters around program evaluation. Also, research also has sort of this sense of generalizability that is a potential, not always, but that's one of the things we tried to do, is to say, by having this research study done and then we replicate that research study, then we can have preponderance of evidence. Whereas a program evaluation, it doesn't necessarily does not intend to have generalizability beyond the program. Thanks for the question. John.
Hi, Dr. Furco. You mentioned you've spoken to how service learning as a pedagogy has been studied. You also talked about the benefits and diminishing returns for students who may already be motivated, be successful in their academic setting versus those who aren't. I'm curious, has service learning been used and or studied as an academic intervention or a social emotional intervention versus a broader pedagogical approach?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you clarify?
Yeah, so I'm coming from a K-12 setting, and we speak a lot about academic intervention. Student is struggling in X. Here are these different approaches we can use.
I understand. Okay.
Service learning has been used in that way.
In practice, I would say, I don't know. I think probably. I mean, I don't know what if. Do you have a specific example?
So many times we hear, I couldn't get this kid to get motivated. I couldn't get this kid to engage in my classes, and then this service learning experience changed that outlook on the student.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. In fact, that's how I got involved in service learning when I was teaching in K-12. So yeah, I was teaching K-12 for a bit, and I felt that my students needed some context and some understanding of sort of the world beyond sort of what was happening in the classroom, and that's how I got involved in service learning. So yes, absolutely, absolutely. I don't know, but that hasn't been. I don't know personally of studies that have looked at using service learning specifically for that motivation. So I don't know if any studies that have sort of centered on that particular aspect of the practice, to answer your question. But in terms of, do we use service learning for those reasons? The answer is, I would say yes. Have we studied that? I don't know of a study that has done that. Does that answer your question, John?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for the question. Is it Christy? Hi, Christy. Oh, Christy, you're muted. Please unmute. I'm sorry, I'm still having trouble hearing you. I think you're still muted there.
There, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
thank you.
sorry. Mine's kind of more of an ask than necessarily a question, because you know, as a K-12 teacher, for a long time doing service learning, and of course being in the collegiate setting, you know, I'm aware of research studies and practices and things, but I think what would benefit K-12 teachers who are using service learning is to have access to that battery of scales and surveys. And I know, you know, like you said, there is a scale about civic development, but I think the time that it takes for a teacher to put together some form of a formative assessment, you know, I tried, and that's what I'm trying to do now, is to put together like, okay, these are questions we could ask before we begin a service learning project. And these are, you know, this is when we should re-ask those questions to see if there's been any change. And of course, I think the big problem in K through 12 with research is replication. You know, it's like you can't, I mean, it's kind of hard to say, okay, this teacher's going to, you know, give it their best and do service learning, and you guys aren't, because we need to compare you. And but also just replication of what went on in that classroom, because every classroom is very, very different. So I just think that if we want to see more research in K through 12, we're going to have that higher ed connection to come in and, you know, teach teachers about capturing data and understanding data, and knowing, you know, the right things to ask in the right way. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think those partnerships, those K-12 higher ed partnerships are really important. I think for those of us who have a foot in higher ed and K-12, teacher educators in particular who are in teacher education programs remain, I think, interested in bridging that and wanting to do. We had International Center for Service Learning Teacher Education that David Malone has been championing and leading for many years, that is looking to do some research on K-12 and higher education and teacher education, in particular, preparing the future teachers for service learning. I've been actually trying to find, while you were saying that, Christy, if that cart is still available.
I tried.
Oh, you did? It's not there?
Yeah, the compendium.
Compendium?
Yep, I couldn't access it. So.
Okay, yeah, because that was an attempt to pull together a series of instruments specifically for K-12. There are some databases that do have instrumentation. They're a little unwieldy in that they're instruments around a whole set of topics. So you have to spend a little bit of time unpacking those. The way I would suggest going about it is to think about if there's a particular study. When I'll send out a version of the bibliography that has K-12 and higher ed, looking at a particular study that might resonate with the kind of outcome you're looking for. Most of those studies do have the instruments at the end included in those studies, or if they don't, you know, to ask for those studies, just write the author and say, could you send me your instrument? That would be a way to, and I do that when I want to replicate a study or I'm interested to see how the questions were asked. So that would be another way, but there isn't an easy way to get these instruments, and instrument development is really not easy either, especially at the K-12 level because of the developmental issues to take into account. So your point's well taken. I think we have Raquel. Is it Raquel? Hi, Raquel.
Hi, yes, it is. I am so sorry. I had some fires that I needed to kind of distinguish when you were talking, but I'm very interested in what you were saying. So if I'm asking a question that you already went over, I'm very sorry. But I was wondering about, you said about that your university is not very far from where George Floyd was killed. And you had said that the question is service learning really impacting the community and how to get that data? So my question basically is, number one, your service learning projects in which they're trying to figure out if the social justice helped, was it done prior pandemic or after the pandemic? Like, was it something? The only reason why I'm asking these questions is because we do service learning projects, obviously, in our community, not social justice in particular. But we do go through and find out how it's impacting. Of course, we can't impact the world, like you said, like if you could, you know, solve homelessness in just a few minutes. You know, we do impact a small portion but I'm wondering now, are we really impacting? And so I was just kind of wondering, like, was this data produced after George Floyd and there were social impact projects that you all did, and you're trying to figure that out, or it was before? That was really what I was trying to figure out. Sorry if you already addressed it.
No. Thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. And so the way I would characterize this is as follows. So we're a big university. We have 50,000 students. We have a big footprint in the community, you know, across the Twin Cities area, and we have hundreds of community engagement initiatives happening simultaneously. And the point I wanted to make was that we're doing all of this work, and yet the community feels like we're not really engaged and we're not having an impact. And so what does it all add up to really? And how do we, and the issue is about how do we measure the impact on the community? And really that it's very difficult to do. What we heard from the community after Ms. Floyd was killed was that, you know, here's, you know, we're saying we have all these initiatives that we've been doing for many years, but look at what's still happening in our community. And so what difference is it all making? And is it making a difference? And so it's trying to put sort of the societal conditions and issues in alignment with the programs and activities that are happening. And that is very difficult to do, right? So that's what the point I was trying to make is there's this mismatch that we say we're addressing issues in the community and we're serving the community, but how to capture that is just really challenging. So that was the point I was trying to make. Does that make sense?
And I feel the same way in my community, but I do see like the initiative we're doing is about reading, because in Nevada, we are so low as far as education. Like we're 52 in the 50 states, you know, including all of our, you know, little people that aren't considered states, you know, like Guam, you know, but just like, you know, we're so low down on the totem pole, and it's so many people that come in and out of Las Vegas and Clark County. It's the 5th largest school district. So it hits it hard. It's not broken up. It's the 5th largest school district in the United States. And yet Las Vegas is so small. So just like, I feel like, especially in urban and rural areas, like we're making this small impact, but you know, how are we really impacting the community? Is it just like what you were saying? Is it just evaluating the program, or is it really making the impact we need? And sometimes I feel like I'm patting myself on the back, like I am doing good. And when I heard you say that, it just like sparks. I'm like, okay, maybe I'm not, you know. So thank you.
Yeah, the question is, can we alone within the educational systems impact the community, or do we have to work multi-sectorally? Do we have to bring the entire community together to work together to address these issues? I mean, we're putting a lot of burden on service learning and educational institutions to make the difference, right? And we don't work in isolation. There's so many confounding issues that go into these community challenges. So how do we work across the different sectors and together? I think that's so. I like the community, the collective impact literature around this, and because I think that's where I think a lot of us are moving towards, that it's about these broad-based partnerships that are working in alignment rather than individual projects around this work. I see that we're down to the last, thank you so much. I see that we're down to the last minute or so. Any final comment or question? If not, I just want to say thank you so very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join today. It's really a delight to have this opportunity to share some things with you, and thank you for the work you do on service learning and community engagement and in education. And thank you for taking the time, like I said, to participate today. Really appreciate it.